Before Christianity took shape, the ancient world was already filled with powerful empires, deeply rooted religions, and long traditions of spiritual searching. It was a time of order and instability, conquest and resistance, wealth and poverty. Into this world, Jesus would eventually be born. But to understand the meaning and impact of his message, it is important to understand the setting into which he entered. At the time of Jesus' birth, the Roman Empire dominated much of the known world, from Britain in the west to the deserts of Arabia in the east. Rome ruled through a combination of military strength, political strategy, and strict administration. Roads connected cities across continents, allowing armies, traders, and ideas to travel quickly. The empire promised peace and stability, but often came through violence and fear. Rebellions were crushed. Taxes were heavy. And those who opposed Roman power were punished harshly. Order was kept, but often at the expense of freedom. Roman religion was public, political, and deeply woven into everyday life. Citizens worshiped a wide range of gods, each with their own temples, priests, and rituals. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and many others were honored through sacrifices and festivals. Emperors were often declared divine, and loyalty to Rome included loyalty to the gods. Religion was not only spiritual, but patriotic. To refuse participation was seen as an act of rebellion. This would become a challenge for early Christians in the years ahead. At the same time, many in the empire followed mystery religions or philosophical schools. These included cults centered around gods like Isis from Egypt or Mithras from Persia. They promised personal salvation and secret knowledge. Others turned to philosophies like Stoicism, which taught self-discipline and reason, or Epicureanism, which encouraged a life free from fear. The ancient world offered many answers to life's big questions, but it was also full of uncertainty and restlessness. Disease was common, war was frequent, and most people lived in poverty. Many were searching for deeper meaning beyond what their cities and gods could provide. In the eastern part of the empire, in the land of Judea, lived a people with a very different religious tradition. The Jewish people believed in one God, the creator of all things, who had chosen them for a special covenant. They followed the laws given to Moses, studied sacred texts, and worshiped at the great temple in Jerusalem. Their identity was shaped by centuries of exile, return, and survival under foreign rule. At the time of Jesus, Judea was under Roman occupation, and tension between the Jewish population and their Roman rulers was high. Within Judaism itself, there were different groups with different ideas. The Pharisees focused on strict interpretation of the law. The Sadducees were connected to the temple and held influence with Roman officials. The Essenes withdrew into the desert seeking purity and separation from society. The Zealots believed in armed resistance against Rome. Many ordinary Jews were simply trying to live faithfully and hope for the coming of a promised deliverer, a Messiah who would bring justice and restore the kingdom of Israel. This was the world into which Jesus was born. Visuals depicting the different Jewish sects, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots. Scrolls being read. A figure of a man in deep reflection, hoping for a Messiah. A world of empire and religion, of power and suffering, of tradition and yearning. It was a world where gods were many, but where the voice of one God still called out to a small nation. It was a world where many paths promised peace, but delivered little. It was a world prepared, though it did not know it, for something entirely new. The story of Christianity begins not with power, but with waiting. Part 2. The Hidden Years, Birth and Family. As they walked, Mary's pregnancy became more pronounced, and Joseph's brow furrowed with worry. They reached the bustling market town of Nazareth, where the sounds and smells of commerce filled the air. There, they met a wise old scholar, a mystic with a kind face and knowing eyes. He spoke of a prophecy, one that spoke of a child born of a virgin, a child who would change the course of history. As they walked back to their humble home, they pondered the weight of the scholar's words. And so, in a humble stable, Mary gave birth to a child who would change the world. Joseph stood by, his heart full of love and wonder, his eyes shining with tears. And so, the Holy Family was complete. A new chapter in the story of humanity had begun. Not with a throne, but with a stable, and not with a king, as the world understood kings, but with a child whose life would forever change history. Long before Jesus gathered disciples or challenged the rulers of his time, he lived in the care of a small and faithful family. His early years were quiet, spent in the shadows of a Roman-occupied village. At the center of this hidden chapter are Mary and Joseph, two figures chosen not for power or wealth, but for faith and courage. Joseph, her betrothed, was a carpenter by trade and a man described as just and righteous. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, far from the comforts of home. Mary and Joseph had traveled there for a census ordered by the Roman authorities. Unable to find proper lodging, they settled in a stable where Mary gave birth and laid her son in a manger. Shepherds visited that night, guided by angels. Later, wise men from the east arrived, bringing gifts. Their visit would bring danger. King Herod, fearful of any threat to his rule, ordered the massacre of young boys in Bethlehem. Joseph again received a warning in a dream and fled with Mary and Jesus to Egypt. After Herod's death, they returned and settled in Nazareth, where Jesus would spend most of his early life. The Gospels offer only one story from Jesus' childhood. When he was 12 years old, his family traveled to Jerusalem for Passover. After 3 days of searching, they found him in the temple sitting among the teachers, listening and asking questions. All who heard him were amazed at his understanding. Yet he returned to Nazareth with his parents and lived in obedience. Luke writes that he grew in wisdom and in favor with God and people. Though these early years remain mostly unrecorded, they were not without meaning. Jesus would have lived the ordinary life of a Jewish boy. He would have learned the Torah, prayed in synagogue, and celebrated the holy days with his family. Under Joseph's guidance, he likely learned carpentry or stonework. The Gospels mention that Jesus had siblings. His brother James would later become a leader in the early Christian movement. Mary remained a constant presence throughout Jesus' life. She stood near the cross as he died. Joseph disappears from the narrative after Jesus' childhood. The hidden years of Jesus are often overlooked, yet they carry deep importance. They remind us that holiness is not only found in public acts or miracles, but also in quiet faithfulness. This chapter of Jesus' life tells us that greatness often begins in small places. Historical map tracing Nazareth, to Bethlehem, to Egypt, and back. Final visual focus on the quiet importance of the family unit. Jesus said to the crowds, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot, and Thaddeus, and Levi and Judas Iscariot, and Simon the Cananean, and Judas Iscariot, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, and Judas Iscariot, and Matthew, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Cananean. They left their nets and followed him. And he said to them, "Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it." As Jesus began to travel through Galilee, preaching, healing, and announcing the arrival of God's kingdom, he did not work alone. One of the first and most important things he did was to call others to follow him. These followers were not scholars or religious leaders. They were fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary men from small towns and villages. Among the many who followed him, Jesus chose 12 men to form his closest circle. These 12 will become the foundation of the Christian movement. Their names were Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alpha, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot. Peter, meaning rock, will be the foundation of the church. Matthew had been a tax collector, a profession deeply disliked by other Jews. Thomas would later become famous for his doubt. Judas Iscariot will become the one who betrayed Jesus. The 12 disciples walked with Jesus for about 3 years. They expected a political revolution, a Messiah who would defeat the Romans and restore Israel. But Jesus constantly redirected them to something deeper. He taught them to love their enemies, to forgive without limit, and to lead by serving others. After Jesus was crucified, most of the disciples scattered. Their leader was gone, and fear overwhelmed them. But then came the resurrection. According to the Gospels, the risen Jesus appeared to them, spoke with them, and renewed their purpose. He told them to go into the world and make disciples of all nations. He promised that they would receive the Holy Spirit. On the day of Pentecost, as described in the book of Acts, the disciples gathered in Jerusalem. A sound like wind filled the room, and what appeared to be tongues of fire rested on each of them. They began to speak in different languages. Peter stood up and preached with boldness, and thousands joined the movement that day. The disciples then began to spread the teachings of Jesus far beyond Judea. They did not seek fame or wealth, but one of love, forgiveness, and hope. Their courage in the face of death and their commitment to Jesus' teachings formed the first generation of Christian leaders. And in doing so, they changed history. As Jesus continued his ministry, the tension around him grew stronger. His teachings challenged the religious authorities, and his growing popularity worried the political rulers. He spoke of a kingdom that did not belong to Rome or the temple elite. When Jesus entered Jerusalem before the Passover festival, he was greeted with palm branches and shouts of praise. But Jesus did not come as a warrior or a political leader. In the days that followed, he taught in the temple, overturned the tables of the money changers. During the Passover meal with his disciples, Jesus took bread and broke it. That night, he went to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. While he prayed, Judas arrived with soldiers. He betrayed Jesus with a kiss, and the guards arrested him. Jesus was taken to the high priest and brought before Pontius Pilate. To avoid unrest, Pilate gave in and handed Jesus over to be crucified. He was led to a hill called Golgotha, where he was nailed to the cross between two criminals. His body was taken down and placed in a tomb. For his followers, everything seemed lost. Their teacher was dead, and their hope had died with him. But on the third day, something happened that would change the world forever. The tomb was found empty. The stone had been rolled away, and Jesus was no longer there. The resurrection was not just a miracle. It was a message. It meant that everything Jesus had said was true. Jesus spent time with his disciples after the resurrection, preparing them for the work ahead. Then, according to the book of Acts, he ascended into heaven. The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus became the heart of the Christian message. His death was seen not as a defeat, but as a sacrifice. His resurrection was seen as the beginning of a new creation. The cross, once a symbol of shame, became a symbol of hope. And the empty tomb became the foundation of faith that would soon spread across empires and generations. After the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, his disciples were left with a message and a mission. That guidance came at Pentecost. It was the birth of the Christian church. In the weeks that followed, the believers shared everything they had. They met daily, broke bread together, prayed. But not everyone welcomed this new movement. Religious leaders in Jerusalem saw the followers of Jesus as a threat. Arrests and persecution began. One of the first Christian martyrs was Stephen. As persecution increased, many believers fled Jerusalem. But instead of silencing the movement, the scattering helped spread it. One of the most important figures in the spread of Christianity was Paul of Tarsus. Originally known as Saul, he had been a fierce opponent. But while traveling to Damascus, he experienced a vision of the risen Jesus. He traveled widely, founding churches in places like Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, and Thessalonica. He wrote letters to these communities. These letters, full of theology and practical advice, became part of the New Testament. As the movement spread, it crossed cultural and social boundaries. It attracted Jews and non-Jews, rich and poor, slaves and free people, men and women. But the Roman world was not always tolerant. Christians refused to worship the emperor or take part in Roman religious ceremonies, which made them seem disloyal. Some were arrested, tortured, or killed, yet their courage and compassion often inspired others. By the end of the 1st century, Christian communities could be found in nearly every major city of the Roman world. These differences made them targets. Christians, by refusing to offer incense to the emperor, were accused of atheism, disloyalty, and even treason. The persecution of Christians did not begin as a single empire-wide effort. In the early years, it was often local and sporadic. Stories of martyrdom became a central part of Christian memory. Perpetua, a young mother from North Africa, was eventually thrown to wild animals. Another early martyr was Polycarp, an elderly bishop from Smyrna. He said that Christ had never failed him, and he would not fail Christ now. He was burned at the stake. The blood of the martyrs, as one early writer said, became the seed of the church. As persecution increased, the early church also became more organized. Leaders known as bishops began to oversee local communities. These bishops, along with elders and deacons, helped maintain teaching and collected sacred writings. Christian writings also began to spread. Despite the suffering, Christianity did not fade. In fact, it grew. By the middle of the 3rd century, Christianity was present in nearly every region of the empire. The suffering of the early church helped shape its soul, and it prepared them for the moment not far off when everything would begin to change. The Emperor Constantine, tired of the endless power struggles within the empire, calls upon his most trusted advisors to gather in the throne room. His advisors, a mix of seasoned politicians and military leaders, begin to share their thoughts on the empire's current state, with some advocating for a more centralized power structure and others pushing for a more decentralized approach. Constantine interrupts the discussion, revealing his own vision for the empire's future, one where the power is shared among the people and the church is given a central role in governing the land. The advisors look at each other, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in dismay, as they consider the emperor's proposal, the air thick with tension and uncertainty. The advisors begin to deliberate on the emperor's proposal, discussing potential benefits and drawbacks of a more decentralized power structure, their voices hushed but urgent as they weigh the consequences of their decision. The advisors present their findings to the emperor, a mix of agreement and dissent as they lay out the potential consequences of his proposal, their words dripping with caution and concern. The emperor listens intently, his face a mask of calm, as he considers the advisor's words, before finally making his decision, a decision that will change the course of history forever. The advisors react to the emperor's decision, some nodding in agreement, others looking on in dismay, as they realize the implications of the emperor's choice, the air thick with tension and uncertainty. The scene fades to black, the sound of murmured conversation and the creaking of wooden chairs the only sound remaining as the fate of the empire hangs in the balance. By the early 4th century, Christianity had grown from a small persecuted movement into a widespread presence. That would begin to change dramatically under the rule of one man, the Roman Emperor Constantine. As he marched toward a decisive battle at the Milvian Bridge near Rome in the year 312, he claimed to have seen a vision. He saw a sign in the sky, a cross of light along with words that promised victory. He won the battle and became emperor of the western half of the empire. Shortly after, in 313, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan. This edict granted religious tolerance throughout the empire and made Christianity a legal religion. Churches could now operate openly. This was a turning point in Christian history. He began to actively support the church. He gave money and land for the building of churches, such as the great basilicas in Rome and Jerusalem. With imperial favor came new responsibilities. The church was no longer an underground movement. It now had access to wealth, power, and prestige. This new relationship raised questions. Could the church remain faithful to the teachings of Jesus while receiving benefits from an empire that had once crucified him? As the church expanded its public role, it also faced serious theological debates. One of the most important concerned the nature of Christ. A priest named Arius taught that Jesus was the highest of God's creations, b.